reoccupying Gaza?
Well, I support taking whatever action is necessary to stop this insane situation. Just imagine. I mean, imagine what Israel is going through. Imagine that 75% of the U.S. population is under rocket fire, and they have to be in bomb shelters within 60 to 90 seconds. So I'm not just talking about New York, Washington, Chicago, Detroit, San Francisco, Miami, you name it. That's impossible. You can't live like that. So I think we have to restore back a reasonable, sustained quiet and security, and we'll take whatever action is necessary to achieve that.
As Israel and Hamas continue to pound away at each other and casualties mount on both sides of this generations-old war, there is now a subtle hint of the O word being used: occupation. Some think it's the only way to bring at very least, a temporary peace to the Middle East. Others recoil in horror at the very thought of a takeover and the untold terrorism that might unleash. Now let's dog and get some truth here. Welcome to MidPoint, Middle East analyst, blogger for Huffington Post, former prisoner of war, freedom fighter, and award-winning documentary filmmaker Matthew Van Dyke joins us on the show today. Matthew, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Matthew, I want to point out first of all a tweet that was sent out by the Israeli Defense Forces yesterday, and as our viewers will see, it is a photo of London with rockets flying over. And this again comes from the Israeli Defense Force, and it comes with the note, Hamas terrorists just fired rockets at southern and central Israel. What if they were attacking your home? In your opinion, has Israel made its world case that they are completely within their rights to do what they are doing and take it as far as they need to protect themselves?
I believe that so far Israel has generally made its case. There's some argument about the level of intensity of the strikes, whether they're precision enough, as John Kerry was caught offhand remarking about. But generally speaking, no country would ever accept thousands of rockets raining down on its citizens by a terrorist organization. And it's important to note that Israel's conflict right now isn't with the Palestinian people, it's with Hamas, a terrorist organization that uses Palestinians as human shields.
But there are those people who would say, hold on a minute, you're right, but the Palestinian people are the ones who put Hamas in power, and they are the ones who are behind them, so they are giving their tacit approval.
It's absolutely true that Palestinians in Gaza elected Hamas, and it remains to be seen in the next election if they will re-elect Hamas. I imagine that given what's currently happening and the blockade on Gaza, that it's unlikely that Palestinians would choose to elect Hamas. But that's also part of the reason why Israel has to be very careful in any negotiations with Hamas now, not to give Hamas any standing to claim a victory in the current conflict that could give them power going into the next election.
Now, we intimated this at the beginning here, but is it not, certainly, if you look at the civilian casualties that are being had here, we talked about it last hour, I'll ask you about it as well, and this comes down to that pinpoint wording that we heard from Secretary of State John Kerry. There are civilians dying, there are people who are eating dinner who are dying, there are missiles flying into hospitals. The Israeli military is a very good military force, though. Is it not somewhat concerning, though, that there are so many civilians dying and so many people that are in civilian settings that are dying?
It's absolutely a concern, and it's tragic that so many people have been killed, and it's not in anyone's interest. It's also not in Israel's interest to have large casualty counts on the Palestinian side. Part of the problem is that Gaza is very densely populated. Israel does make attempts to warn people to leave areas that will be targeted. Hamas, on the other hand, encourages Palestinians to stay in their homes, to stay in the locations. Hamas has said that they intend to break the blockade of Gaza through blood. And they don't mean the blood of Israelis, they mean the blood of their own people, by causing the international outcry against Israel. They want Israel to retaliate. They know that rockets don't do much damage to Israel, but the retaliation causes bloodshed among Palestinians that they can use for propaganda.
You certainly have been on the...
a casualty...
No, please, finish.
Yes? Well, a high casualty count is not in Israel's interest, but it actually is in Hamas's interest for their propaganda purposes.
You certainly have been on the ground before, and now we're hearing, as I mentioned, the O word, the word occupation. Benjamin Netanyahu said it, some of his members of his cabinet have said it, some of his representatives are even hinting it. But there are those who believe that this would just be a tragic mistake, that this would lead to much more bloodshed, and that is not necessary. I'll go to the other side. Some say the only way to shut this down is you have to get in there, you have to ferret this out right from ground level. In your experience and from what you've seen here, is occupation a good idea or simply just another bad mistake?
Occupation would be a disaster. Israel left Gaza many years ago, and I believe that was the correct policy. In fact, from Israel's perspective, it sort of makes their case about whether independent Palestine would be a threat to Israel or not. When they pulled out of Gaza, people elected Hamas, and Hamas started firing rockets at Israel. On the other hand, Israeli occupation doesn't serve the Israeli people very well over time because it's led to just a continuation of the conflict. Israel should probably start withdrawing from the West Bank as well. And if things went the same way in the West Bank that they've gone in Gaza, they'll have to go in and, as the Israelis say, mow the grass, take out the terrorist elements with the minimum loss of civilian life, and try to maintain their security. But the region's always going to be volatile. It's always going to be a problem. And the fact is there's very little that the United States can do about it.
All right, now I'm going to hit right there. You just hit the last couple of words here. Very little the United States can do about it. Would you expand on that, please? Because there are those people sitting here in America and others around the world who say that the government needs to do something. The government needs to get involved. But we also have to preface that with the fact that there are those in the Middle East right now who have told John Kerry, stay home. We don't need you. It's not something that you need to be here for. So are we once again just butting in where we don't belong?
In this case, I believe we are. I believe that the United States generally has a strong role and a leadership role to play, not just in the Middle East, but throughout the world. However, in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, time and again, both sides have shown that they could care less what the United States says. A lot of times, our intrusions actually end up causing more damage than good. The current crisis will be solved with negotiations between Egypt, Israel, and Hamas, and they really don't care, any of them, what the United States has to say about it.
Does this not really in many ways come down to, we're talking about this and certainly what's happening in the Ukraine between separatists and nationalists there as well. This comes down to religion at the very core of it. And again, you've had a lot of experience with this. You've been on the ground. You've studied this. You've looked at it. Is it just not fair to say that trying to settle something or trying to bring democracy to an area that is so based on religion is simply just an impossibility?
I'm not sure that's true. You know, Jews and Arabs lived together fairly peacefully for quite a long time. They consider each other to be cousins in many parts of the world. You know, sectarianism tends to come up during times of politicalization, as you see currently in Syria. I believe that there is the possibility of coexisting with democratic governments. A lot of the conflict is political. A lot of it does go back to the War of 1967. I wouldn't necessarily chalk it up to an impossibility, but it certainly takes time, and it might take a few more generations before people are able to put their differences aside and actually genuinely pursue a peace settlement here.
I want to turn to the Ukraine here as well, because this comes down, and I mentioned this a little bit, what comes down between the separatists and the nationalists who are sitting there. Is there really any way that you can see of reconciling these two sides? Because there's a proposal out there, at least an idea that's being floated, that Ukraine is completely broken and needs to be separated in two. We can only imagine how disastrous that would be for the region and also for Ukraine itself. So is there really any possible way of reconciling these two sides?
It's completely unacceptable to allow Putin to try to recreate a Russian empire by carving territory off of Eastern European countries. If even a year ago anybody had suggested that Russia would be doing this and at the same time an Islamic caliphate would be established in Iraq and Syria and that the United States would do nothing about it, nobody would have believed it. Yet here we are. You know, the only solution really is the United States should be supporting the Ukrainian government with military aid, with intelligence, with advisement, to help them defeat the separatists, kick Putin back across the border, and end this. You know, this flight would not have been shot down if separatists had not been allowed to operate freely in eastern Ukraine. There really is not going to be a negotiation. Putin feels like the international community will do nothing, and the Obama administration has time and again shown itself to be quite possibly the weakest administration on foreign policy this country's ever had, which only encourages thugs like Putin around the world.
I've got less than 60 seconds to go, but I'm going to make a correlation there between Hamas and Putin. You talk about kicking Putin over to Russia. People talk about kicking Hamas out. But isn't it fair to say that we have two entities here that no matter how much you kick them, they will come back? They do seem to come back. There's got to be a way to hammer them down once and for all, but it simply doesn't seem possible in today's world.
I believe in Russia, if we ratchet up economic sanctions enough that Russians are hurt economically, they will no longer politically support Putin. And also, quite possibly, in Gaza, with the current crisis combined with the blockade, it's possible to erode Hamas's support. The Palestinians will not elect them anymore. Once Hamas fades from power this time, it's quite unlikely they will ever regain power. So it is certainly possible. Since these leaders are elected in both countries, if you ratchet up the economic hardship on people and make the political cost of electing such thugs as your leaders, an unacceptable cost, and they won't continue to make that same mistake.
Still comes down to getting down to the economics and hitting people where it hurts in the wallet, much like Putin and all of his buddies as well. Matt Van Dyke, thanks so much for joining us. Please, let's do it again.
Thank you for having me.
Coming up next hour, an exclusive interview with former Vermont Governor Howard Dean. And right after the break, the global perception of the United States, and if we're getting a good idea of our leadership from homegrown critics, what do they really think about us on the other side of the ocean? That and a whole lot more when we continue right here on MidPoint, where every day we question everything.